On a cold morning in the late autumn of 1943, a Liberty ship coming in from Naples dropped anchor in New York Harbor. In the forward cargo hold, in the dark, in the smell of diesel and sweat and old vomit, a young German infantryman named Reinhold Pabel was one of about 1,000 prisoners of war who had not seen the sun in 3 days. An American voice called down through the hatch, in accented German. Up top, Pabel climbed the ladder. He stepped out onto the deck, and in the next 40 seconds, he understood something the German army would not officially admit for another 2 years. The lights of the harbor were on, all of them. Every pier, every warehouse, every ship at the wharf. The city stretched away into the darkness beyond the water, in a long, low blaze that made no sense, because for 3 years the country he came from had lived under total blackout, and every man on that deck had been told that America was blockaded, bombed, starving, and finishing. None of it was true. He could see it from where he stood. If you had a father, an uncle, a grandfather who guarded German prisoners at a camp somewhere in Iowa or Texas or Kansas or Colorado in those years, this is the story of what your family, without ever raising a rifle, was quietly showing the enemy. To understand what Reinhold Pabel saw from the deck of that Liberty ship in the late autumn of 1943, you have to understand what he had been told, from the age of about 15, was true. Pabel was 28 years old that autumn. He had been born in 1915, in the middle of the First World War, in a Germany that would spend the next 30 years of his life losing every argument it picked with the outside world. He was, by education and background, a schoolteacher. He had studied history in Berlin. He read English. He was not, by any honest measure, a fanatic. He was a middle-class German boy who had come of age under the Weimar Republic, watched it collapse, and been drafted into the Wehrmacht in his 20s like almost every other man of his generation. By the summer of 1943, he was a Feldwebel, a sergeant in a Panzer Grenadier regiment. He had fought in Poland. He had fought in France. He had fought in Sicily. He had been captured a few weeks earlier, in the fighting around Salerno in Italy, in September of 1943, and shipped from there to a series of American prisoner camps that would eventually leave him, at the end of the war, in Illinois. But right now, in the last hour before dawn, on a morning in November or December of 1943, standing on the deck of that Liberty ship in New York Harbor, he was doing what every German prisoner in his cohort was doing in those first minutes on American soil. He was checking what he had been told against what he could see, and what he had been told by his own government for the last 4 years went roughly like this. America was decadent. America was weak. America was a mongrel country of racial mixing that had lost the will to fight. American cities had been repeatedly attacked by long-range Luftwaffe bombers. Manhattan had been on fire more than once. American shipping had been strangled by German U-boats in the Atlantic, to the point that the eastern seaboard was running out of food. American factories were shuttered. American workers were rioting. American Negroes, in the propaganda pumped out by Joseph Goebbels's Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, were being lynched in the streets by white mobs at a rate that made the country ungovernable. American Jews, who according to that same propaganda secretly controlled Washington, were fleeing to Canada. American morale was, in the phrase Goebbels, used in more than one broadcast, on the verge of collapse. None of that was true. Some of it, on the small end, had a kernel of truth. There was real racial injustice in America in the 1940s, and Goebbels was skilled enough to know that a lie built on a small truth held up better than one built on nothing. But the picture he was painting for the German public and for the German soldier was a fiction. And by the late autumn of 1943, more and more of the men in Wehrmacht were about to find that out, one at a time, from the deck of a Liberty ship in an American port. Between the summer of 1000 942, and the end of the war in Europe. Roughly 371,000 German prisoners would be shipped to the United States and held in a network of camps that would eventually grow to over 700 separate installations spread across most of the states in the Union. Almost every one of them, at some point during their stay, would go through what Reinhold Pabel went through on the deck of that ship in New York. Some would go through it in the port itself, watching the harbor lights come up. Some would go through it later, on the train ride across the American interior, watching Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska roll past a Pullman window that reflected their own thin faces back at them. Some would go through it in the camp itself, the first time an American guard, without particular ceremony, handed them a plate of beef and potatoes and butter and coffee, the kind of meal a German soldier at the front had not seen in 2 years. They would call it, later, in their memoirs and in the interviews they gave to American historians in the 1970s, the moment of recognition. Pabel himself, in the memoir he would publish 12 years after the war, under the title Enemies Are Human, would use a different phrase. He would call it, simply, the moment I understood we could not win. He was one of 4 men in this story whose experience will stand in for that of hundreds of thousands. The first is Pabel himself, Reinhold Pabel, 28 years old at his capture, a schoolteacher in uniform, a man who would spend 2 years in American captivity, escape from an Illinois camp in the autumn of 1945, live undetected in Chicago for 8 years under the name Philip Brick, run a used bookstore on the North Side, marry an American woman, turn himself in voluntarily in 1953, be pardoned, and stay in Chicago for the rest of his life. He died in 2008, at the age of 93, in the city he had first slipped into as a fugitive from the United States Army. The second is Georg Gärtner, an Obergefreiter, a lance corporal, in the Afrika Korps, 23 years old in 1943, captured, along with about 250,000 other German and Italian soldiers, in the collapse of Rommel's army in Tunisia in May of 1943, shipped to America, held at Camp Deming in New Mexico. He would escape from that camp on the 21st of September, 1945, 4 months after the war in Europe ended, and spend the next 40 years of his life living in Colorado and California under the name Dennis Wiles, working as a ski instructor in Aspen, marrying an American woman, and building an entire adult identity that had no connection at all to the man he had been when he crossed the Atlantic. He would turn himself in on the Today Show on NBC in September of 1985, at the age of 65, because he had decided he wanted to die under his real name. He would die in Colorado in 2013, at the age of 92. He was the last German prisoner of the Second World War known to be still living in the United States. The third is Jürgen Wattenberg, Captain Lieutenant, Naval Lieutenant, commander of the German submarine U-162 until his boat was sunk in the Caribbean in September of 1942, and he and his surviving crew were fished out of the water by the Royal Navy and eventually handed over to the Americans. 44 years old in 1944, a career Navy officer, a hard man, a real believer, one of the last of the classical Prussian professional class. He would end up at Camp Papago Park in Arizona, and he would, on the night of December 23, 1944, led 24 other German officers through a hand-dug tunnel, 178 feet long, out under the wire, in the largest single escape of Axis prisoners on American soil during the war. Every one of them would be recaptured. Wattenberg would last longer than any of the others before he was picked up in a Phoenix restaurant, because he could not shake his German accent from his English. The fourth is an American, Colonel Edward Davison, 46 years old in 1944, a Scottish-born poet and academic, a professor of English literature at the University of Colorado before the war, a man with steel gray hair and reading glasses, and the quiet manner of a man who had spent most of his adult life inside a book. In 1944, he was drafted, quietly, by the United States War Department to run a program that almost nobody outside of Washington knew existed. It was called the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division. Its job was to take the roughly 370,000 Germans held in American camps, and, without any of them being fully aware of what was being done, turn them into something the German government of 1933 to 1945 had spent 12 years trying to make sure they would never become Democrats. Not with a rifle, not with a beating, not with a lecture from a colonel in an American uniform standing over them with a clipboard. With books, with films, with magazines printed in German, in America, by other German prisoners who had begun, on their own, to understand what their own country had done to them. Davison's program would eventually run about 24,000 German prisoners through its most intensive tracks. It would send them home when the war ended, changed men. Some of those changed men would become teachers in the new West Germany. Some would become journalists. A handful would become politicians in the Bundestag. A few later would become ambassadors. The full effect of what Colonel Davison quietly did in those camps has never been fully counted, and probably never will be. But there is a case to be made, and serious historians have made it, that the successful re-education of the German prisoner population in the United States between 1944 and 1946 was one of the most quietly consequential American operations of the entire war. Not one of the loudest, one of the quietest, and, in the long run, one of the most important. Those four men, Pabel and Gertner and Wattenberg and Davison, are how we are going to tell this story. Because the story is not really about camps. It is not really about escapes. It is not really about tunnels, or beef rations, or Hollywood films, or the price per day paid to a German prisoner for cutting hay in Kansas. The story is about what happens when you take a young man who has been told, from the age 15, that a certain country across the ocean is finished, and you put him on a boat, and you sail him across that ocean, and you let him look at that country with his own eyes. The story is about what he saw. The other man in the room throughout this story, without ever appearing directly, is the man who had been telling those young Germans what to expect. Reichsminister Dr. Joseph Goebbels, in the summer of 1943, in his office in Berlin, Goebbels was at the peak of his power. He controlled every newspaper in Germany. He controlled every radio broadcast. He controlled every newsreel that played in every cinema in the country. His voice, his written word, and the images he chose to release were, for the German's civilian and the German soldier, the entire picture of what the outside world looked like. He had been telling them for 4 straight years that America was collapsing. He had a problem he did not yet know he had. Between May of 1943 and May of 1945, over 1/3 of a million German soldiers were going to see America with their own eyes. And when the war ended, they were going to come home, and they were going to tell their families, and their friends, and their neighbors what they had actually seen. Goebbels would not live to hear those stories. He would take his own life in a Berlin bunker at the end of April 1945, along with his wife and their 6 children. But his lies would outlive him for a few months, and the men who had been told those lies, and who had been shown the truth in an American port on an autumn, would outlive both. They would come home. They would go back to the wreckage. They would rebuild a country that had almost nothing left. And they would remember, for the rest of their lives, the moment they had stepped up onto the deck of an American ship, in an American port, and understood, without anyone needing to say it to them out loud, that the war had already been decided. The lights had been on. That was enough. The route almost every German prisoner took into the United States, 1,942 and 1,945, ran through one of three ports on the eastern seaboard: Norfolk, Virginia; New York Harbor; Boston Naval Yard. Which port you came into depended, mostly, on which theater you had been captured in, and which convoy you had been loaded onto for the crossing. Norfolk was the port of choice for the men taken in North Africa. It was the closest American deep-water port to Casablanca and Oran, the two main Allied embarkation points along the Mediterranean coast of French North Africa. The Liberty ships that had brought American soldiers and American war material across the Atlantic in one direction, empty, in convoy, had to have something to carry on the way home to justify the fuel and the escort. Prisoners were, in a purely logistical sense, ballast, living ballast. Ballast that had to be fed and kept alive under the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention, but ballast all the same. The Africa Corps men, Georg Gartner among them, mostly came in through Norfolk in the summer and autumn of 1943. New York was where the Italian theater prisoners tended to come in. Reinhold Pabel, captured at Salerno in September of 1943, and shipped out through Naples once the port had been cleared, came in through New York sometime in the late autumn of 1943 or the early winter of 1944. The exact date is not in any surviving record I have been able to check. What is on the record is that when his ship came up the harbor in the last hour before dawn and the sky lightened over Brooklyn, the first thing he saw was the Statue of Liberty. He wrote about it later in Enemies Are Human, not with anger, not with mockery, with something closer to embarrassment, because he had been told, in the propaganda he had been reading in the German press for the last 4 years, that the Statue of Liberty was a Jewish monument. That was the phrase Goebbels had used, a Jewish monument put up by Jewish financiers to symbolize Jewish control of the American state. Pabel wrote that when he first saw it, in the gray light of that November or December morning, he did not think about Jews. He did not think about propaganda. He thought about the fact that it was very large, and that it was made of green metal, and that it had been standing in that harbor since 1886, which meant that it had already been standing there for 31 years. By the time his own country had lost the First World War in 1918, it had been standing there when his father was a young man. It would be standing there when he himself was a very old man, if he lived that long, he thought, standing at the ship's rail, that whoever had put it up had not been afraid of the future. That was Pabel's port. Boston was where the men from the later fighting in Northwest Europe tended to come in, along with prisoners transferred from British holding camps in southern England when the British ran out of space. Boston processed a smaller total than the other two ports, but it processed the men who tended to be the most beaten down by the time they arrived, because they had already spent months in British custody in poor conditions before being shipped west. Once you were off the ship, the American system took you. They marched you, in columns of 2, down the gangway to a receiving area on the pier. They took your Soldbuch, your Wehrmacht paybook. They took your Erkennungsmark, your identity disc. They took your belt. They took your bootlaces, which was standard procedure for prisoners on their first day, because a man who has to hold his own boots on with his hands cannot easily run. They stood you against a wall, in the American style, and they photographed you, front and profile, holding a small board with a number on it. That number would be the name the United States Army called you by for the rest of the war. Then they put you on a train. The trains were the second shock, Because the trains were Pullman cars. If you have never seen an original Pullman sleeping car from the American railroad system of the 1940s, it is difficult to convey what a strange object it was to a German infantryman coming out of the collapse of North Africa or the ruins of the Italian front. A Pullman car was, in its ordinary civilian use, a rolling luxury hotel. Green plush seats that folded down at night into beds. Individual reading lamps. Waiters in white jackets who came through with coffee and sandwiches. Curtain bunks. Polished brass. The Pullman car was the way middle-class Americans crossed their own continent in the years before commercial aviation made everybody stop bothering. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States Army routinely used Pullman cars taken over from civilian service for the duration of the war to move German prisoners from their arrival ports to their camps in the interior. A German infantryman who had spent the last 2 years riding in wooden boxcars on the Ost front and the last 2 weeks lying in the bottom of a Liberty ship would climb the steps of one of those Pullman cars, look at the green upholstery and the reading lamps and the polished brass, and, in many cases, refuse to sit down, because the assumption, based on everything he had been told for 4 years, was that this was some kind of Amerikanische propaganda trick. A trick, a stage set, that the moment he sat down, an American officer would come through the door with a camera and take a photograph to send back to Berlin. The photograph would never come. There was no trick. That was just what an American train looked like. The trains left the eastern ports and moved west. Some went south, down through the Carolinas and Georgia, toward the camps in Alabama and Louisiana and Texas. Some went straight across the middle of the country, through Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, toward the great camp complexes in Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa. Some went further, all the way to Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona, where the largest camps of desert Southwest were. The Germans watched America go by out the windows. That is where a lot of them broke, because you can prepare a man for a city. A city can be, in his imagination, a bright anomaly, an unrepresentative capital, a Potemkin front thrown up for foreign eyes. But you cannot prepare a man for the American Midwest. You cannot prepare him for what 600 miles of continuous, unbroken, undamaged farmland looks like from a train window in June. You cannot prepare him for a country in which every farmhouse has an automobile parked in front of it, and every barn is painted, and every silo stands full, and every crossroad has a gas station, and a diner and a general store with the lights on and the shelves stocked. The German prisoners on those trains had come out of a Europe in which every farmhouse had been touched by the war, in one way or another. Their own fathers, if their fathers were still alive, were working land that had been rationed for 4 years. Their own mothers were queuing for bread. Their own children, the ones who had them, were being evacuated ahead of the Allied bombing campaigns. They watched Iowa go past the window. They watched Kansas. They watched Nebraska. And most of them, at some point during the ride, understood the same thing. They were not going to win this war. Not because they had been outfought. Because they had been outproduced. Because the country their leaders had told them was collapsing, had in fact spent the last 3 years building an industrial and agricultural base that made everything the German war economy could do look small. You do not need to be a strategist to understand that from a train window. You just need to be able to count silos. By the time those trains reached the camps, the men on them were, most of them, already halfway to the private conclusion that would define the rest of their war, and, for many of them, the rest of their lives. The war was over. Their leaders had lied to them about the enemy. The country they had been told was already beaten had in fact barely been touched. The camps themselves were the third shock. There were, at the peak, about 700 of them. That number includes both base camps and the smaller satellite work camps that were set up on farms, in canning factories, and in lumber operations wherever local American labor had been drained away by the draft. The base camps were spread across most of the continental United States. Only 2 of the 48 states in the Union, when the count was finished, had never held a German prisoner of war. 3 of the camps are worth naming here because they are going to matter in this story. The first is Camp Concordia in the plains of north-central Kansas. Camp Concordia was a large base camp, holding about 4,000 prisoners at its peak, and it was fairly typical of what an American POW camp of the Middle War years looked like from the inside. Rows of low wooden barracks, painted white, a mess hall, a chapel, a small library, a hospital, a double fence of barbed wire around the perimeter, with guard towers at the corners. Beyond the wire, in every direction, the wheat fields of Kansas, running to the horizon. If you had climbed one of the guard towers at Camp Concordia in the summer of 1944 and looked out, you would have seen very little that suggested a war was going on anywhere. The second is Camp Trinidad, in the southeastern corner of Colorado. Trinidad was the camp the American Army sent the difficult cases to, the hardcore Nazi non-commissioned officers, the SS men who could not be trusted around ordinary Wehrmacht prisoners without starting fights, the officers who had refused to accept that Germany was losing. Trinidad was smaller than Concordia and more heavily guarded. It had a reputation inside the German prisoner community in the United States as the camp you did not want to be sent to, because the men already there would test you the day you arrived, and if they decided you were insufficiently loyal to the Reich, your life inside the wire was going to be unpleasant in ways the American guards would not know how to prevent. The third is Camp Papago Park, in the desert outside Phoenix, Arizona. Papago Park held German naval officers, most of them Kriegsmarine, many of them former U-boat crew captured in the Atlantic. Naval prisoners had a reputation, on both sides, for being the most stubborn and the most disciplined of the German prisoner population. They had spent the war in what was still, at least for the officer corps, largely a volunteer service, deep in an ideological identification with the Nazi regime that was not universal in the Wehrmacht, but was very common in the Kriegsmarine officer corps. Papago Park was where the United States concentrated most of them, precisely because their concentration in one place made them easier to watch. It was also where they were going to give the American Army its single largest headache of the entire prisoner of war program. 2 things before we walk into the camps themselves. The first is the Geneva Convention of 1929. The United States, in 1929, had signed a set of international rules about the treatment of prisoners of war that required, among many other things, that prisoners be fed a ration equivalent to that provided to the garrison troops of the detaining power, which meant, in the American case, that German prisoners of war in the United States were fed, by law, the same ration as an American soldier at a stateside base. That ration in the middle years of the war ran to about 3,400 calories a day. It included beef 6 times a week, coffee, milk, butter, bread, fresh vegetables in season, fruit, eggs, for a German soldier who had spent the last 2 years on the Ostfront, where the standard ration had sometimes fallen below 2,000 calories a day and had, at bad moments, dropped to almost nothing. This was not just adequate food. This was a diet many of them had not seen since before the war. Most of them gained 5 to 10 kilograms in their first 3 months in American captivity. The second thing worth saying, before we walk into the camps, is what those camps looked like to the local Americans who lived near them. Because a great many Americans had never met a German before. Some of them had never met a foreigner. Some of them, especially in the smaller Midwestern towns, had never met anyone who did not speak English as a first language. And now, in the summer of 1943, and the summer of 1944, and the summer of 1945, 945. They had 4,000 of them at a time, working in their wheat fields, walking through their small-town main streets under light guard, sitting on the beds of American trucks with straw hats on their heads and canvas work gloves in their hands, singing in German as they came in from the harvest at the end of the day. What happened between those local Americans and those German prisoners is one of the small forgotten miracles of the whole war, because in most cases, in most places, in most of those small towns, what developed was not hatred. It was not fear. It was something more like puzzled hospitality. The German prisoners worked hard. They did not cause trouble. They were polite to the American farm wives, who fed them at noon, and they were young men, some of them very young, a long way from their own mothers. More than one American farm family, when the war ended and the prisoners were shipped back to Europe, cried at the loss of a young German they had come to think of as almost a member of the household. More than one German prisoner, when he got home to the ruins of his own country in 946, wrote back to those American families and stayed in touch with them, in some cases, for the rest of his life. That was not what the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had said would happen. It was what actually happened. Reinhold Pabel arrived at his first American camp in the last weeks of 1943. The exact camp is not certain from the records I have been able to verify, but by the middle of 1944, he was at a base camp in Illinois, and it was from that camp, or a satellite of it, that he would eventually escape in the autumn of 1945. The camp he arrived in was, by his own later description, unremarkable. The wooden barracks, the mess hall with its long trestle tables, the double fence, the corner towers, the bored American guards, most of them older men or wounded veterans who had been rotated out of frontline service and given camp duty because they could no longer be spared for combat. What surprised him, and what would surprise almost every German prisoner in his cohort, was not the physical camp. It was what happened inside it. There was a library. There was a chapel that held services in German every Sunday, run by German prisoner chaplains who had been captured with their units. There was a soccer field. There was, in most of the larger camps, a small orchestra of German prisoner musicians, put together by the men themselves out of whatever instruments the American authorities were willing to buy for them out of the camp canteen fund. There were classes in English. There were classes in mathematics, in engineering, in agriculture. Some of the men studied for a Reifezeugnis, the German high school leaving certificate, from behind the wire of an Illinois cornfield. There was, in the evening, a movie. Not every evening, but most evenings in most of the base camps. The movies were American, and they were run without subtitles, and they were shown on a bedsheet strung up at the end of the mess hall. The films were the ordinary Hollywood product of the years 1942 through 1946. Comedies with Bing Crosby, cartoons from Walt Disney, dramas from Frank Capra, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton reruns, musicals, the occasional war picture, though the American authorities were careful about which war pictures they showed the German prisoners, since some of the wartime propaganda films could be counterproductive. The Germans watched. Their English was not good at first. It got better, movie by movie, week by week, month by month. The language of American popular culture worked its way into the ears of a generation of German soldiers who had come into the war believing that America was culturally exhausted and morally decadent, and who were now, without being able to help themselves, laughing at Bing Crosby movies. Outside the barracks, in the daylight hours, most of them worked. The American economy in 1944 had a labor problem. Almost 12 million young American men were in uniform. They were not in the wheat fields of Kansas. They were not in the canning factories of Wisconsin. They were not in the lumber camps of Oregon or the pea harvests of Washington State. The country was fighting a two-ocean war on borrowed labor, and when Washington realized in early 1943 that it was about to have several 100,000 young able-bodied Germans sitting in camps in the middle of the American continent doing nothing, the labor policy shifted almost overnight. By the summer of 1944, German prisoners were working, under contract, on American farms and in American food processing plants, from Massachusetts to California. They picked cotton in Arkansas. They cut wheat in Kansas. They harvested peaches in Georgia. They packed tomatoes in Ohio. They cleared timber in Wisconsin. They dug potatoes in Idaho. They repaired fences and dug irrigation ditches and mucked out barns, and did every unglamorous piece of agricultural work that the young Americans who normally did that work were not there to do, because those young Americans were, in most cases, in a foxhole, somewhere in France or Italy or the Pacific. They were paid, under the Geneva Convention, at a rate of 80 cents a day, which was small by American civilian standards, but enormous by the standards of a German soldier at the front, because 80 cents a day, saved up over a year of work, added up to something. A prisoner who worked steadily through 1944 and 1945 could accumulate a few $100s in credit at the camp canteen. He could buy cigarettes. He could buy candy. He could buy paper and pencils and books. He could buy, in some camps, a musical instrument. He could also, if he was going to escape, buy an American road map at the canteen and hide it in his mattress. Georg Gärtner, at Camp Deming in New Mexico, worked as a field laborer in the surrounding countryside. He was 23 years old, in reasonably good health, and he was, by the time he had been in the United States for a year, fluent enough in American English to hold a normal conversation with the American farm families who fed him and the other prisoners at noon in their kitchens. He observed. He watched how Americans stood. He watched how they held cigarettes. He watched how they laughed at jokes. He watched how they said their names. He did not know, in the summer of 1944, that he was preparing for what would come next. But part of him, quietly, was. The first serious trouble in the American camp system did not come from an escape. It came from inside a camp in Arizona on the night of the 12th of March, 1944, in a shower room at Camp Papago Park. The man who died that night was Werner Drexler. Drexler was 21 years old, a German seaman captured off a U-boat in the North Atlantic in the middle of 1943, shipped to a special naval interrogation facility called Fort Meade in Maryland, and, over the course of 7 months, quietly turned by American naval intelligence into an informant against his own fellow prisoners. He had told the Americans everything he knew about the men who came through Fort Meade after him, who had said what, who was loyal to the regime, who might be flipped, who might not. Drexler was, in the language his fellow submariners would have used, a verrater, a traitor. He had one thing going against him, beyond his cooperation with the Americans, which was that the American naval officers running Fort Meade knew what he had done, and they knew what would happen to him if the men he had informed on ever caught up with him. It was their job to keep him safe. It was, in effect, the one thing they owed him in exchange for what he had given them. On the 12th of March, 1944, for reasons that have never been fully explained in the surviving American records, Werner Drexler was transferred out of Fort Meade and shipped to Camp Papago Park in Arizona. Camp Papago Park was the camp holding the largest concentration of Kriegsmarine prisoners in the United States. Many of the men in that camp had come through Fort Meade themselves. Some of them had been personally betrayed by Werner Drexler. When Drexler stepped off the American Army truck at the gate of Camp Papago Park in the middle of the afternoon on the 12th of March, 1944, he was recognized inside of about 10 minutes. By nightfall, a small group of German U-boat sailors had made a decision. Sometime between 11 at night and 1 in the morning, in the shower room of Compound 1 at Camp Papago Park, Werner Drexler was seized, beaten, and hanged from a pipe in the ceiling with a piece of rope that had been braided together from strips torn out of a bedsheet. 7 men were involved. Their names are on the record because they were, in the end, all convicted. Helmut Fischer, Fritz Franke, Günter Quilsen, Heinrich Ludwig Bernhard Reyek, Otto Stengel, Rolf Wizui. The American Army investigated the killing. It took the American investigators several months to piece together who had been in the shower room that night. It took another year to bring the 7 men to a general court-martial. The court-martial was held under American military law because the killing had taken place on American soil under American Army jurisdiction, and it convicted all 7 of premeditated murder. They were sentenced to hang. The sentences would not be carried out until the following summer. When they were carried out, on a single morning at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, they would set a record that the American military justice system has not equaled since. But that morning was still a year and a half in the future, in the spring of 1944. In the meantime, the American War Department had a different project underway. A project that in the long run would matter more than any of the escapes and more than any of the killings. A project that had been quietly conceived in Washington in the summer of 1943, approved by the White House in the autumn, staffed up over the winter, and put into full operation in the middle of 1944 under the command of a middle-aged Scottish-born poet in an American colonel's uniform. Colonel Edward Davison arrived at his new office in Washington in the spring of 1944, with a set of orders that were, on their face, absurd. He had been told to take the German prisoner population in the United States and prepare them, without their knowledge, for a role in the political reconstruction of Germany after the war. He was to do this using books. He was to do this using magazines. He was to do this using films. He was to do this using classes taught by carefully selected German prisoner instructors, working under the light hand of American academic advisors. He was to do this without ever explicitly telling any prisoner that he was being re-educated, because the moment a prisoner realized that was what was happening, the ideological reflexes drilled into him for 12 years of Nazi rule would kick in and he would refuse to cooperate. Davison, who had spent the previous 15 years teaching English literature to American undergraduates in Colorado, was, on paper, an unlikely choice for the job. He had no operational intelligence background. He had never worked in a prisoner of war camp. He had never, so far as the record shows, spoken a word of German in his life. What he had was a reader's temperament and a poet's patience, and the War Department decided, correctly as it would turn out, that those were the 2 qualities the job actually required. His first move was to identify, inside the American camp system, the small population of German prisoners who were already, quietly, opposed to the Nazi regime. There were more of them than most people would have guessed. Some were Social Democrats from before 1933 who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht against their political convictions. Some were Catholics who had never trusted the party. Some were younger men, less indoctrinated than the professionals, who had, on their own, gone through the same kind of ideological reversal on the deck of a Liberty ship that Reinhold Pabel had gone through in New York. Davison's staff found them, quietly interviewed them, and moved the most promising of them to a special camp at Fort Getty, Rhode Island, and to 2 other administrative training centers. At Fort Getty, they were put to work. The most visible piece of Davison's operation was a magazine. It was called Der Ruf, The Call. It was written in German. It was produced in the United States. It was edited, at the working level, by 2 young German prisoners named Alfred Anders and Hans Werner Richter, both of whom would go on, after the war, to become significant figures in post-war German literature. The magazine was printed on ordinary American newsprint and distributed, free to every German prisoner of war camp in the country. Its first issue was dated the 1st of March, 1945, 6 weeks before Hitler's suicide in Berlin. Der Ruf did not, on its cover, present itself as an American propaganda operation. It presented itself as a German prisoner magazine, written by prisoners, edited by prisoners, about the experience of being a German prisoner in America, and, more importantly, about the question every German prisoner was now beginning to have to think about, which was what kind of country Germany was going to be after the war ended. Its editorial line was subtly pro-democratic, pro-reconciliation, anti-Nazi, though never in a way that would provoke the hardcore prisoners into a boycott. It printed reflective essays by prisoners about the moral collapse of the regime that had sent them to war. It printed reports from American cities. It printed reviews of American books that had been translated into German for the prisoner library system. It printed, in its later issues, essays about what it was going to feel like to go home. The men who read it did not always know they were being worked on. Most of them, by the time they read the 3rd or 4th issue, did not care. Around the magazine, Davison built the rest of the program. Selected prisoners were sent to intensive courses in American history, in American constitutional law, in comparative political science. About 24,000 men went through the most intensive versions of these courses. They were taught by a mixture of American academics and carefully vetted German prisoner instructors. They read the Federalist Papers in German. They read Lincoln's speeches in German. They read the German philosophers of the 19th century that the Nazi regime had banned or distorted, in an attempt to reconnect them with the intellectual tradition their own government had cut them off from. The men in these programs were not told, in so many words, that they were being prepared to run post-war Germany. But when they went home in 1946 and 1947 and 1948, a great many of them, quietly, did exactly that. Some became teachers. Some became local officials. A few became journalists. A handful, over the following decades, became figures in West German national politics. The full effect of Davison's operation is impossible to measure exactly, because you cannot run the counterfactual. You cannot know what post-war West Germany would have looked like if the American government had not spent the last 2 years of the war quietly working on the political education of the German prisoners it happened to have in its custody. What can be said is that West Germany, in the years after 1945, became the most stable and the most democratic country the German people had ever produced, and that a non-trivial number of the men who helped make it so had, in their late 20s or their early 30s, spent a year or two of the war years reading Lincoln and the Federalist Papers in German on the wooden bunks of an American prisoner of war camp, somewhere between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. That was one project. The Kriegsmarine at Camp Papago Park had a project of their own. By the middle of 1944, a small group of German naval officers at Papago Park had been quietly digging a tunnel under one of the barracks in Compound 1. Their leader, and the man whose imagination had shaped the whole enterprise, was Kapitän Lieutenant Jürgen Wattenberg, 44 years old, former commander of U-162, a naval officer of the old pre-war school, who had never, in almost 2 years of American captivity, stopped thinking about escape. Wattenberg's tunnel was, by the standards of amateur digging inside a wire fence, a serious piece of work. It ran for 178 feet, from the floor of a coal shed inside the compound, under the double perimeter fence, out into the dry ground of the desert on the far side. It had been dug over roughly 4 months, mostly at night, using tools stolen from the camp work parties and improvised out of the ordinary hardware of the barracks. The dirt from the digging had been dispersed by carrying it out, a handful at a time, in the pockets of the men returning from work details, and scattering it into the loose sand along the sides of the paths inside the compound. The exit hole broke the surface sometime in the middle of December 1944. Wattenberg and his co-conspirators decided to make their break on the night of the 23rd of December, Christmas Eve, on the reasonable assumption that the American guards would be at their most distracted on the eve of a major American holiday. 25 German officers went out through the tunnel between 8 and 10 in the evening on December 23, 1944. Their plan was to head south, they believed, on the basis of an ordinary American commercial road map that they had obtained from some side camp, that they could reach the Gila River a few miles to the south of Phoenix and follow it west and then south into Mexico. Once in Mexico, they hoped to make their way to the coast, find a neutral ship, and eventually return to Germany. The plan had one problem. The Gila River in the American Southwest does not flow in December. It is a seasonal watercourse. In the dry months of the winter, it is a bed of sand and gravel with occasional stagnant pools, running through cactus country that has almost no cover, almost no water, and almost no food. The American commercial map they had used to plan the escape did not indicate this, because the map was designed for people driving their cars along paved highways, not for men trying to walk south through the desert to Mexico in the middle of winter. Within 72 hours, most of the escapees were being rounded up. Some had made it as far as the empty river bed looked at it and turned back. Some had been picked up hitchhiking on the shoulder of a paved highway by American police officers who had been told to look for men with German accents. Some had walked into farm buildings looking for food and had been reported by the farmers. By the middle of January, 24 of the 25 had been recaptured. Wattenberg lasted longer. He had, over the previous year, been more careful than most of the others in his preparations. He had accumulated a set of civilian clothes, item by item, through the camp trading network. He had let his hair grow out of a military cut. He had studied his English every night. He had, on the night of the escape, gone south with a companion for the first 2 days, and then split off on his own, on the theory that a single man was easier to hide than a group. He made it to Phoenix. He slept, for most of a month, in an abandoned building in the desert on the eastern edge of the city, coming into town during the day to look for food. He kept his hat pulled down over his forehead. He did not speak more than he had to. He listened, in the American diners where he ate, for the rhythm of American English, and he practiced it, silently, sitting alone at the counter. He was picked up, in the end, on the 28th of January, 1945, 37 days after the escape. The story of his capture is one of the small human stories that survived the war and made its way into the record, because it is, in its way, funny. Wattenberg, hungry and running out of what small change he had, walked into a Mexican restaurant near the railroad tracks in Phoenix on a January evening. He sat down at the counter. He tried to order dinner. His English by this point was good enough, but his accent, which was a solid mid-Atlantic German officer's English of the 1930s, was not. The waiter behind the counter was a young man who had, until his own recent medical discharge, been a soldier in the United States Army. He listened to Wattenberg order. He looked at Wattenberg. He walked back to the kitchen. He asked his manager to call the police. Wattenberg finished his dinner. He paid the bill. He walked out onto the sidewalk. 2 Phoenix officers were waiting for him at the curb. He did not run. He said, in German, and it is the one line of his own that has come down through the histories with certainty, that he had been expecting them for some time, and that he was tired. They put him in the back of the car and drove him back to Camp Papago Park. The Great Escape was over. there is a small, sad postscript to the story of Werner Drexler that closes out this middle part of the story. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended. Germany had surrendered on the 8th of May. The occupation had begun. The prisoner of war population in the United States was beginning to be prepared for repatriation, though the repatriation itself would not really get going in earnest until the following spring. In the middle of all of that, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, on the morning of the 25th of August, 1945, the American Army carried out the sentences it had handed down almost a year earlier in the Drexler case. 7 men were hanged that morning, not one at a time over the course of several days, as would have been the more usual American military practice. All 7 on the same morning, on the same set of gallows at the United States Disciplinary Barracks, one after another, over the course of about 90 minutes. Fischer, Franke, Coulson, Ludwig, Rayach, Stengel, Wizow. It was, and as of the time this is being written it remains, the largest single-day mass execution in the history of the modern United States military. It took place 8 days before the formal end of the Second World War, which would come with the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, 1000, on the 2nd of September, 1945, and about 109 days after VE Day. The 7 men were buried without ceremony in the prisoner of war cemetery at Fort Leavenworth. Their graves are there today. If you visit the cemetery, you can walk past them. They are small, flat stones with names on them, in a row. Werner Drexler, whose killing they had died for, was buried elsewhere. His grave in a small American military cemetery is also still there. Someone, most years, still puts flowers on it. Nobody has ever been sure who. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945. The war in the Pacific ended on the 2nd of September of the same year. The German prisoners in American camps in the middle of the American continent were, on paper, free to go home. They did not go home immediately. The American, British, and French governments had, in the last months of the war, quietly agreed that the German prisoner population would be used as forced labor to help rebuild Europe. Not indefinitely, but long enough to bring in the harvests of 1945 and 1946, clear the rubble of destroyed cities, and rebuild the transportation networks that the war had shattered. Some of the German prisoners in American custody were, in 1946, transferred to Britain and to France, where they continued to work under Allied supervision until as late as 1948. Most of the American-held prisoners went home, though, in a great slow wave that ran from the late autumn of 1945 through the summer of 1946. For most of them, going home meant going back to something they no longer recognized. The Germany they had left in 1941 or 1942 or 1943 was gone. The cities they had grown up in most cases, had been bombed to rubble by the American and British air campaigns of the previous 3 years. Berlin was a wasteland. Hamburg was a wasteland. Cologne, Dresden, Frankfurt, Essen, all of them were, block after block, unrecognizable. The industrial infrastructure was destroyed. The rail network was destroyed. The food supply had collapsed. The post-war occupation authorities were feeding the civilian German population at a ration that, in some sectors, was lower than the ration Germany itself had given to its concentration camp in the last months of the war. The men coming home from the American camps stepped off the trains, in most cases into cities where their own families were living in cellars. Many of them had trouble finding their families at all. The mail systems had broken down. Old addresses were rubble. Old neighborhoods no longer existed. A German prisoner released from an American camp in Kansas in the winter of 1946 might spend months tracking down whether his own mother was still alive. Some of them, having found their families and looked at what was left of their country, quietly made a decision that would surprise no one who had watched them get off the Liberty ships in Norfolk 2 or 3 years earlier. They decided to go back to America. The exact number who did this in the years after the war is hard to establish with precision. The estimates in the historical literature run into the several thousand. What is clearly documented is that a non-trivial share of the men who had come to the United States as prisoners between 1,943 and 1,945 came back to the United States legally as immigrants between roughly 1,948 and the middle 1960s. Some married American women they had first met while working in the fields near their camps. Some came back to specific towns where they had been treated well. A few came back and married the daughters of the American farm families who had fed them at noon during the war. That was the quiet ending of the largest and most improbable population exchange of the 20th century. Hundreds of thousands of young Germans had come to America against their will. Some tens of thousands in the years afterward came back on purpose. Reinhold Pabel was one of them. Pabel had escaped from an American prisoner of war camp in Illinois in the autumn of 1945. In the confused weeks between the end of the war in the Pacific and the beginning of the American repatriation program, his escape was, by his own later description, almost casual. He had walked away from a work detail with a small amount of money he had saved from his prisoner earnings and made his way to Chicago. In Chicago, he had presented himself to a Lutheran minister as a Baltic German refugee whose papers had been lost in the war. The minister had helped him find a place to live and a name to use. The name he chose was Philip Brick. He lived under that name in Chicago for 8 years. He opened a small used bookstore on the north side of the city. He learned enough American English to pass. He married an American woman named Kay Cotter. He had, by 1953, become, in every practical respect, an American. Then he turned himself in. He did not have to. He was not under investigation. Nobody was looking for him. He could have gone on being Philip Brick, bookseller, of Chicago, for the rest of his life, and nobody would ever have known. He turned himself in because, in his own words to a Chicago newspaper reporter at the time, he was tired of lying to his wife. He was arrested. He was held briefly. He was, in the end, quietly deported to Germany. But the deportation was almost immediately followed by an application for legal readmission to the United States on humanitarian grounds, which was granted. Pabel returned to Chicago. He returned to his bookstore. He returned to his marriage. He lived out the rest of his life in the city he had first walked into as an escaped prisoner of war, and he died there in 2008 at the age of 93 with an American passport and an American wife and an American grandchild. His story was by then mostly forgotten. Georg Gärtner's story lasted longer, and in some ways it went deeper. Gärtner had escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico, on the 21st of September 1945, 4 months after the end of the war in Europe and 3 weeks after the end of the war in the Pacific. He had been part of a work party, clearing brush along a rail line, and in the middle of the afternoon, he had simply walked off into the desert with the small canvas bag containing everything he had accumulated over his 2 years in American captivity. He caught a freight train. He rode it west, and then north, and then west again. Within a week, he was in California. Within a month, he was, under the name Dennis Wiles, working construction in Los Angeles. He would live under that name for 40 years. He moved, over the decades, from California to Colorado. He learned to ski in the mountains west of Denver, and he became, by the middle 1950s, a ski instructor in Aspen. He married an American woman named Jean in 1964. He had a comfortable middle-class American life. He voted in some American elections, though he would later be careful in interviews not to say which ones. He paid taxes. He owned a car. He had friends who had no idea who he was. In 1985, at the age of 65, he called Arnold Kramer, the American historian, who had written the definitive book on the German prisoner of war program in America, and asked for his help. He was tired, he said, of dying by inches under someone else's name. He wanted to end his life as Georg Gärtner. He wanted to be found. Kramer arranged it. On the 11th of September 1985, Georg Gärtner walked into a studio at NBC in New York City and, on the Today Show, live on national television, told an audience of several million Americans who he was and where he had been for the last 40 years. He was not arrested. There was, by 1985, no serious American legal interest in prosecuting him. The Second World War was, by then, 40 years in the past. The United States and West Germany were the closest of allies. Gärtner had, in every way that mattered under American immigration law, become a de facto American already. He was allowed to stay. He was granted, eventually, formal legal status. He wrote a book about it, with Kramer, called Hitler's Last Soldier in America. It was published later that same year. He died in Colorado in 2013 at the age of 92, the last known German prisoner of war of the Second World War, still living in the United States. His American wife survived him. So did the American life he had built. Jürgen Wattenberg, the naval officer who had led the Great Papago escape, went home. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946, along with most of the other Kriegsmarine officers held at Papago Park. He returned to civilian life quietly, in a country that no longer had a navy for him to serve in. He lived in West Germany for the rest of his life. He died in 1995, at the age of 95. Colonel Edward Davison went back to academic life. He had been a professor of English literature before the war. He was a professor of English literature after the war. He taught for the last 2 decades of his working life at Hunter College in New York. He did not, so far as the surviving record shows, ever talk publicly about the prisoner of war re-education program he had run. It was, in the American style of that generation, one of the quiet things he had done in the war that he did not need to advertise afterward. He died in 1970 at the age of 72. The camps themselves came down. By 1947, most of the American installations that had held German prisoners between 1942 and 1946 had been either dismantled, converted to civilian use, or simply abandoned and left to be reclaimed by the American landscape. The wooden barracks were, in most cases, torn down or sold off to local farmers, who used the lumber for barn additions and chicken sheds. The barbed wire came down. The guard towers came down. In a few places, the memory survived. Camp Concordia in Kansas has a small local museum today, in the last surviving building of the old camp complex. Camp Aliceville in Alabama has a museum too. Papago Park in Arizona has a marker in a public park that indicates the location of the German officers' tunnel and the compound it ran from. If you know what you are looking for, you can still find traces of the largest prisoner of war operation in the history of the American continent, scattered across the American landscape, mostly ignored by the people who now live around them. The men who ran those camps, the American Guards, mostly older men and wounded veterans, went home to their own quiet post-war lives. They did not write memoirs, mostly. They did not go on lecture circuits. They spent the next 40 or 50 years of their lives being, in the way of their generation, the kind of American man who did not talk very much about the war unless somebody asked him a direct question, and, even then, not necessarily very well. Some of them stayed in touch for years with the specific German prisoners they had gotten to know inside their camps. There are, in the archives of the American Midwest, small collections of letters between former American camp guards and former German prisoners that ran for decades. They are, in most cases, not literary letters. They are Christmas cards, photographs of grandchildren, small notes about the weather, the occasional obituary of a mutual friend. They are the record of what the American propaganda of 1943 through 1945 was quietly getting right, without anyone in Washington fully understanding how important it would turn out to be. Which brings us back to the deck of that Liberty ship in New York, in the last hour before dawn on a morning in November or December of 1943, and the young German infantryman who stood on it and looked at the lights of the harbor and understood something his own government had spent the last 4 years trying to make sure he would never understand. Reinhold Pabel spent 40 seconds looking at those lights and understood what his officers had spent his entire adult life denying. He was one of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who came to America in those years. Almost every one of them, at some point during his stay, would understand something similar. Some of them would understand it on the deck of the ship, some on the train, some in the mess hall, over a plate of American food, some in a Kansas wheat field, watching an American farmer drive a tractor across a piece of ground that would have fed a German village for a year. They came home. They rebuilt their own country. They helped make it, in the second half of the 20th century, one of the most stable democracies in the world. They did not do this because an American colonel with a clipboard had told them to. They did it because, at some point in their captivity, they had looked around and understood, without being told, what a functioning free country looked like from the inside. That was the thing Joseph Goebbels had spent 4 years lying about. That was the thing the United States, without ever needing to advertise it, quietly showed them. A country that could light its cities in wartime when its enemies could not. A country that could feed its prisoners better than it fed its own soldiers, and not go broke doing it. A country that could put German officers on Pullman cars and hand them books and show them Charlie Chaplin movies, and at the end of 5 years, get most of them back on a boat headed home carrying, in their heads, an idea about how a country could be organized that had nothing at all to do with the country they had left. If your own father, your uncle, your grandfather guarded German prisoners in a camp somewhere in Iowa or Texas or Kansas or Colorado or Arizona in those years, this is the story of what he was quietly doing. Not with a rifle, with a country, with a lit street and a full store, and a paved highway running west across a landscape that no bomb had ever touched. He was showing them what they had been fighting, and most of them, in the end, understood. That was enough.